Hexavalent chromium. (29 CFR 1910.1026), Subpart Z, Toxic and hazardous substances. This standard applies to occupational exposures to chromium-6 in all forms and compounds in general industry. Chromium properties. May cause lung cancer from breathing airborne CR6, irritation or damage to the nose, throat and lungs, respiratory tract, if CR6 is inhaled, irritation or damage to the eyes and skin if CR6 contacts these organs. Chromium properties. CR6 is widely used in pigments, metal finishing, electroplating, wood preservatives and fungicides, and in chemical synthesis as an ingredient and catalyst. For maintenance employees, hexavalent chromium, hexchrome, is a carcinogenic substance produced in a variety of welding and hot work processes. Health effects. Can be toxic if swallowed, inhaled or absorbed through skin. May cause allergic respiratory and skin reactions. Can cause burns via all exposure routes. Long-term exposure can cause other adverse health effects. Primary routes of entry for maintenance employees. Inhalation from welding fumes. Who is at risk? Painters, CR3 and CR6. Abrasive blasting workers, CR3 and CR6. Workers involved in the maintenance and servicing of copying machines and the disposal of some toner powders from copying machines, CR6. Battery makers, CR6. Candle makers, CR3 and CR6. Die makers, CR3. Printers, CR3 and CR6. Rubber makers, CR3 and CR6. Cement workers, CR3 and CR6. Workers involved in welding, cutting, brazing, soldering, torch and other hot work operations, CR3 and CR6. Chromium action levels. Action level means a concentration of airborne chromium-6 of 2.5 micrograms per cubic meter of air, 2.5 g per cubic meter, calculated as an 8-hour time-weighted average, TWA. General ventilation or local exhaust ventilation, LEV, is recommended. Exposure determination. The employer shall determine the 8-hour TWA exposure for each employee exposed to chromium-6. Two methods are assigned. Scheduled monitoring option. Performance-oriented option. Initial monitoring to determine the 8-hour TWA exposure for each employee on the basis of a sufficient number of personal breathing zone air samples to accurately characterize full shift exposure on each shift. For each job classification. In each work area. Schedule monitoring option. If monitoring reveals employee exposures to be above the PEL, employer shall perform periodic monitoring at least every 3 months. Schedule monitoring option. Perform additional monitoring when there has been any change in the production process, raw materials, equipment, personnel, work practices, control methods. Changing a process is a way to reduce your exposure. TIG welding on stainless steel reduces exposure compared to traditional stick welding. This is an example of an engineering control. Also, isolating the source of exposure with barriers and reducing the hazard with ventilation and exhaust systems are other examples of engineering controls. Simply opening doors and windows to let in fresh air can also help reduce exposure. Respiratory protection. If engineering and work practice controls do not sufficiently reduce exposure, then appropriate respirators must be used to further reduce employee exposure to the permissible exposure limit or below. Anyone using respiratory protection must be approved through the company's respiratory protection program following OSHA 1910.134. Personal protective equipment. Where hazard is present or likely to be present from skin or eye contact with chromium-6, the employer will provide appropriate personal protective clothing and equipment, PPE. Safety glasses. Respiratory protection. Leather welding jacket. Type welding gloves. Welding helmet. Welding cap. Leather spats. High-top leather work boots. Leather apron. Prohibited activities. Prohibit chromium removal from PPE by blowing, shaking, or any other means that disperses chromium-6 into the air or onto an employee's body. No eating, drinking, smoking, chewing tobacco or gum, or applying cosmetics in regulated areas, and don't bring these items into regulated areas. Housekeeping and cleaning methods. Maintain all surfaces free as practical of accumulations of chromium-6. Use damp, wet methods to clean your areas as much as is reasonably possible. Avoid using compressed air to clean if possible. Hazard awareness. Communication of chromium-6 hazards to employees. Chemical manufacturers, importers, distributors and employers shall comply with all requirements of the Hazard Communication Standard, HCS, 1910.1200, for chromium-6. In classifying the hazards of chromium-6, at least the following hazards are to be addressed. Cancer. Eye irritation. Skin sensitization. Employers shall include chromium-6 in the Hazard Communication Program established to comply with the HCS, 1910.1200. Ensure that each employee has access to labels on containers of chromium-6, access to safety data sheets,